For all the changes and innovation that have come out of the war in Ukraine, there is one specific system that I think has changed how we'll conduct warfare for the next, at least few decades. And it's not drones. It's kind of a cop-out answer. I mean, most people at least, have thought for a long time that drones are very loosely the future of warfare. But there's one type I want to dial into here. But before getting to that, I'm going to talk through a few examples that we've seen come out of the war in Ukraine of drones in the sea, on land, and in the air. First, a quick thank you to today's sponsor, Acre Gold. Acre lets you invest in physical gold without coming out of pocket all at once. You can subscribe for as little as $30 a month, and then once your stash reaches the price of one of Acre's bars, they ship you physical gold discreetly direct to your door. Check out the link in the description to learn more, and thank you to Acre Gold for sponsoring today's video. The first type of drone to hit on here are the Waterborne variety. So it's the video that we're looking at right here was from a Ukrainian attack on a Russian naval vessel in early August. Now, the idea of waterborne UAVs isn't really new. The idea of packing explosives into a boat and driving it into the side of another boat, it's been around for quite a while. But, this model that we're seeing in Ukraine, and to be clear, I don't think we have all the specifications coming out of this quite yet and all the technology that's gone into it. It looks pretty modern, right? I think it's safe to say this is a little more advanced than just an old canoe packed with TNT. The interesting thing with these waterborne drones, as Ukraine continues to use them in the Black Sea, is that this system has allowed Ukraine to vote in the naval war with Russia, which I don't think anyone would have expected, right? I mean, from the early days of the war, there was a pretty strong belief that the Black Sea was largely going to be ceded to the Russian Navy. They're just, the Ukrainian Navy, there wasn't much left at the start of the war. What were they going to do against the Black Sea fleet? And it's not a crazy thought. But these waterborne UAVs have, in a sense, kind of leveled the playing field when it comes to naval warfare in the Black Sea. I'm not sure I would necessarily say that Ukraine has the upper hand in that fight. But again, for a long time, we didn't necessarily think they'd be competing in that space at all. So it's something to keep in mind when we look out towards future conflicts with countries that maybe don't have a very robust Navy or even no Navy at all. This type of waterborne drone could potentially allow them to contest the waterways around their country. Something I have to bring up when talking about these waterborne drones is just the risk of using this weapon system in the Black Sea. I mean, there is a ton of commercial shipping going through that body of water, and it's only so big. There's only so many places they can go. And, some of these drone launches from Ukraine over the past few weeks and months, they've traveled 100 plus miles to strike their targets. Now, those targets to this point have all been Russian naval vessels, so I feel like maybe it's not, as top of mind as it could be, but that could be a major turning point in this war. Things happen with drones. They malfunction. The guidance system goes off, or maybe the operator looks at a Turkish cargo vessel and mistakes it for a Russian warship. And then, that doesn't automatically mean the war escalates into something larger, but it, sure makes it more complicated. This is somewhat unique to the Black Sea, at least in terms of looking at the war in Ukraine and the territories around it. You can pull up maps and watch international ships moving through that body of water. But, for instance, when you look at, live flight trackers over Ukraine, commercial aircraft are just not flying over that airspace. And rightfully so, right? There's so many surface-to-air missiles flying through that airspace. Of course, any commercial airliner is going to do their absolute best to avoid that. But in the Black Sea, to a degree, they're kind of dodging these waterborne UAVs. Then, of course, because of that concern, Russia will say that Ukraine should not be launching these waterborne drones across the Black Sea, which, on the one hand, got it. I would argue that the root cause there isn't Ukraine launching these waterborne drones, but the fact that Russia has invaded and continues to occupy large portions of Ukraine. Maybe if they, left that area, there wouldn't be waterborne drone attacks. Shifting over to the land domain, there have been a handful of innovations on that front, ground-based UAVs. There's a handful of demining UAVs being used in the battlefield. Not very many at this point. Tends to be something so far that has to be used quite a bit back from the front, and they're super expensive. A recent video came out showing that Ukraine had strapped an M240 machine gun to the top of a tracked drone that was just flying all over a range, slinging rounds in every direction. Looks cool, looks interesting. At least it's not those creepy robot dogs we saw coming out of China a few years ago. But I don't know that there's a place quite yet for this on the modern battlefield. The reason I say that is we do have the mechanisms to aim and fire like a machine gun remotely. That's existed for a while. So that technology is there. But there's a couple things that come to mind when I see this that makes me think, maybe it causes more problems than it resolves. One of the issues that comes to mind is the idea of a runaway gun, which is, quite frankly, when the machine gun keeps firing after you want it to stop. It can be a little bit startling because it's, still going on full auto. So imagine you're laying there on the machine gun, firing the weapon system, you release the trigger, and then it continues to fire. One of the fixes there when you're manually firing the weapon system is you just break off the belt of ammunition, and then 3, 4, 5 rounds later, there's no more ammo for it to fire. So problem solved. I don't know how you would do that when it's, on top of a UAV. If that gun, and there's, a handful of mechanical or maintenance issues that can cause a runaway gun to happen, but it's not the rarest thing in the world. It does exist out there in real life. So if a runaway gun happens on a UAV that's being remotely operated, what do? You just point that thing down and wait for it to run out of ammo? Do you dare approach the system and try to fix it yourself? I don't know, but that's, one issue. The other thing that comes to mind, and this is personal experience, maybe it was a bad experience, but we used to use some of those EOD robots in Afghanistan that would go out and kind of probe around IEDs to see if it was an IED or just trash in the road and all that kind of stuff. And again, just one man's experience, they were awful. They would get stuck on everything. They had a hard time traversing any sort of difficult terrain. Like, God forbid they had to go over a curb or something. It was just done. So for those robots to function correctly, it really needed like a clean battle space. And you don't always get that in war. I mean, think about some of the pictures coming out of Ukraine right now between the trenches and the crater-filled landscape. I don't know how confident I would be in a machine gun on the top of a robot driving around that battlefield thinking that it'd be able to stay upright for any significant period of time. Now, I did hear one argument that kind of makes sense about how this could be used in the modern battlefield. It's not necessarily engaging enemy troops, but more that it could be moved around to different positions at the front to kind of confuse the enemy as to where, strong points or machine gun nests are located, potentially drawing enemy fire to that location. It's just a robot over there with a machine gun as opposed to, an actual fortified position. I'm kind of mixed on that. I mean, I understand the value something like that would have on the modern battlefield, but if that's the problem we're trying to solve, I don't know. I feel like a tracked UAV with a mounted machine gun and a remote firing system is just, a little bit over-engineered. Now, there are some land-based UAVs that I think have some application on the battlefield. Ukraine Territorial Defense Forces recently put out some pictures showing what is essentially a casualty evacuation vehicle. They took another one of these tracked drones, small tracked drones, strapped a litter to it, and they show some pictures where they're able to, fix a casualty, strap them in, and move, up to 330 pounds as far as 3 kilometers away. Now, I don't see any cameras on this drone or robot, or at least none in the pictures that Ukraine put out. So it looks like you'd have to maintain line of sight to get this thing to work. There is a place for it. I can see the use case. If you're, if a trench line is under attack and there's, consistent small arms or indirect fire, the idea of strapping a casualty to one of these and just sending them, 2-3 kilometers to the rear to a casualty collection point where they can get medical attention without taking 2, 3, 4 people out of the fight at hand, it's not crazy. Makes sense. One of the concerns that comes to mind when looking at this is just, what happens if that drone, say 500 meters on its way to the casualty collection point with a casualty strapped on top, runs out of batteries or hits an obstacle that it can't get around. There's nobody there to be able to take care of that person. And if they're critically wounded, that could be the time where they bleed out. Whereas if you had 2, 3, 4 people moving that casualty from the point of contact back to the rear and a tourniquet comes loose, or you start to see, blood in an area there wasn't previously blood, you can take the time to stop, administer additional care, and then continue on to the medical site. I mean, it's a concern. I don't mean to shoot everything down. I think this is a really good idea. Anything that can help get casualties off the battlefield and to a point of care faster, that's a win. Then moving into the air domain, and this is an area where I think prior to this war, when people said drones are the future of warfare, this is what they thought about, right? They thought about Predators and Reaper drones, and then when Russia invaded Ukraine, it was all about the Orlan drones coming out of Russia, or the Bayraktar drones being flown by Ukrainians after sourcing them from Turkey. That played a major role in the early days of the war, and it was kind of expected. We'd seen it in past conflicts, not just that the U.S. had been involved in, but others all around the world. But those big, expensive military-grade drones didn't last very long in a contested airspace like we've seen over Ukraine really from day one. So most of those are very good at their job, but the minute you put in a substantial surface-to-air threat, they're just not worth it anymore. At least the bang for the buck isn't there. Then you've got all different sizes of off-the-shelf quadcopters that are gathering intelligence, adjusting artillery strikes, or even dropping munitions on enemy positions. But it's the loitering munitions, the FPV-style homemade drones by Ukraine, and the Lancets by Russia that I think, again, personal opinion, has changed how warfare will be conducted for the next 10, 20, even 30 years. Now, breaking this down just a little bit, on the Russian side, the one that's more known is the Lancet. It's military grade coming out of Russian military factories. In a sense, it's kind of how the United States would solve the loitering munition question. We would put that through a factory. It'd be the standard one going out to all the forces. You see more of that on the Russian side. The Ukrainian side are these FPV, first-person view drones, where they're strapping RPG warheads to these things and crashing them into the side of any Russian target. Much more homemade, but still pretty effective. And to be fair, we are seeing a handful of those come out of the Russian side as well. There's just, if you had to draw a line, I'd say more of the, professionally manufactured is coming from Russia. More of the homemade is coming from Ukraine. The kind of game-changing deal when it comes to loitering munitions, whether they're coming off the factory floor in Russia or being strapped together for the first time in the Ukrainian trench, is that they are cheap, effective, and accurate. So for months now, both sides have been using loitering munitions to attack troops in the open, troops in fortified positions, soft-skinned vehicles, armored vehicles, and they've kind of taken over as the primary asset when it comes to counter-battery fire. I mean, have you seen some of these kind of rudimentary cages thrown up around artillery firing points? Those aren't going to do anything against enemy, rocket or cannon artillery. They're there to stop loitering munitions. I mean, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, the biggest threat that both sides are just constantly worried about are FPV drones and Lancets. I mean, all of a sudden, it seems like drone operators, the drone pilots, could become some of the most impactful soldiers on the battlefield. I mean, I saw a video come out just the other day where, you're going to have to take some of this with a grain of salt, but it makes sense, big picture. The video description said that a group of Russian drone pilots were kind of standing on the outskirts of this building. They were being hunted by Ukrainian drone pilots. So there's a couple different views, and it kind of makes sense. They're at a point in the building where they would have, an unobstructed connection with their drones over the Ukrainian trench lines. But you can see this kind of weird dystopian type of warfare where it's the drone operators targeting the other drone operators, and that is what can help shift the momentum on the battlefield. Now, there are means to protect against these loitering munitions. It's not like it's just a total free-for-all and they can strike at will. You've got electronic warfare or any number of air defense assets. But as the quantity of this type of essentially homemade missile spikes on the battlefield, it forces more of these air defense assets further and further forward. So you no longer can have your major EW and air defense assets set a little bit back from the front. They have to be front and center because some of these FPV and Lancets, after they take off, can strike their target inside of 1 kilometer after launch. Now, of course, not every loitering munition makes it through and strikes home. We've got a video here of a Russian drone narrowly missing a group of Ukrainian soldiers as they exit the battlefield. Just worth remembering that most of the videos we see have been somewhat curated, right? We're not going to see the ones of drones shot down. We're not going to see the ones where they miss the target. Those generally kind of get filtered out, and the ones that make it onto social media, be it Telegram, Twitter, YouTube, or elsewhere, are going to be the effective strikes on any number of weapon systems, really from either side. Now, to be fair, we do have loitering munitions in the U.S. inventory as well as the means to defend against them. But what we're seeing playing out in Ukraine is that the cost to manufacture these is getting cheaper and cheaper, and they're being pushed down to lower and lower levels on the battlefield. So, you got to think that there are countries and individuals all around the world watching this play out and taking notes and figuring out how they could do it better. And, it's going to be a real challenge going forward. But that's all I got for now. Be sure to check out the national security sit reps that I put out on Substack if interested. The link is in the description below. But thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.